Chillcast MMA. Alright, what's up, guys? So I'm just going to be wrapping up over these next couple episodes, going to be wrapping up the conversation I started this week. The theme for this week has pretty much been the end of year, end of decade list. So I'm going to keep that going, but this time I'm going to switch the focus. Already talked about ESPN, DAZN, Bellator, what that means. Already talked about the fans, consumerism, and how over time all of that is pretty much going to play out. But now I want to talk about some of the fighters that over the past year, and at least for now, talk about one fight in particular over the past decade that I want to highlight. So I've got 3 fighters polarizing for different reasons. Just want to go over some of them. And that's basically it. Like I said, just trying to figure out the format of this. You guys can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. You can always hit me up if you have any questions, anything like that, anything specific. And again, once the new year gets rolling and I get more of a solid format for that, I'll be uploading some fighter interviews, some different media member interviews and stuff like that. Betting tips, more collabs on the way, so please just stay tuned. Sorry, for this one, it's going to be a little bit more laid back, but the 3 fighters that I wanted to go to, this is going to be, like I said, a little bit more laid back. So I'm just going to go through 3 of them briefly and then give my reasoning for why I'm about to say what I'm going to say. So the first one for me, Kevin Lee. Why am I bringing him up? For this past year, he's only been 1-1 in 2019. And as far as we sit right now, he's got an 18-5 record overall, 7-3 out of his last 10. The second one is TJ Dillashaw. He's 16-4 overall. And then we've got Jorge Masvidal. And I just wanted to get the names out real quick. Jorge Masvidal, he's 35-13 overall. But for Kevin Lee, I would say he's my most polarizing pick. When I think of a fighter that you made me feel a lot of emotions when it comes to watching you fight, development inside and outside the cage, I feel like Kevin Lee, at least for this year, he was probably the most polarizing one for me. Like I said, he went 1-1 this year. So it's not like he fought a lot of times. We don't have a lot of information to go off in that regard. Just in terms of, we all knew what he was going through with his coaches. He made that well documented when the Tony Ferguson fight went down. He had a lot of issues with that, the passing of his coach and trying to find a replacement or, as far as training is concerned. And he ended up, via Joe Rogan and anyone that watched that podcast, that was eye-opening as well. That was sort of like what I mean, a part of watching this guy develop outside of the cage in the public eye. But he ends up in Canada. He ends up at TriStar with Faraz Sahabi, GSP, and those guys. He comes out, UFC, MSG, does damage against Gregor Gillespie, puts numbers back on the board, gets his name in the conversation again. And it's like, again, when I think about most polarizing, it's like I go from you enter this year with a loss against Ali Kenta, and then you follow that up with a loss to Rafael Dos Anjos. It's like you're in weird territory. And even anyone that follows him online, Kevin Lee I'm talking about here, after that fight with RDA, it was like you could just see it all over his social media, or at least via the video he posted and subsequent interviews that took place afterwards. He was feeling that one. He was feeling that loss, and he was questioning where his place is. It really felt like he was just stuck in a rut. Yet, with one fight later, because MMA is very much like, what have you done for me lately? But nonetheless, it's like to go from this guy loses one more, he might be on the way out, to he puts down Gregor Gillespie, a ranked competitor who was, I do believe, 6-0 in the UFC at that time. And that, everyone was saying that was a dangerous fight. And for Kevin Lee to go in there and put him down, that's huge. And it sets him up for a huge 2020. And again, I don't really know, sitting here trying to forecast because of his technique. And one of the knocks on him has been just how he puts things together. He has the individual techniques to be a champion. You can see it, or at least for me, I feel like I see it. I feel like his double leg is strong enough. His single leg is good enough. His boxing, his submission defense. But when you talk about putting them together in a coherent way, I don't know if one fight against Gregor Gillespie after, you had a 2-fight winning skid, I don't know what that necessarily says about you getting back into title contention, especially if we're talking about guys like Khabib, Jorge Masvidal, Who knows what's going to happen tonight? UFC 245, Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington. I'm pretty sure by the time this is going to be uploaded, that'll be figured out. But nonetheless, that's just sort of to my point. These guys at the top tier, is he ready for the top tier, or is he just the best of the guys in the middle tier? This was a year where we got to figure that out. But one thing that I can say is I feel like I got the sense that he's now a fixture. He's now here to stay. He does take his career extremely serious. And hey, he went 500 this year. But in going 500, only fighting twice, I feel like I learned so much outside the cage about where his head is at. Seeing him actually try to develop, try to put things together. So that's it. I'm not saying that's my fighter of the year in terms of, he had the most at stake and he was able to rise to the occasion. It's not that, but when I think of the fighter that was the most polarizing, the fighter that actually made me feel something. In this day and age with fights every weekend, Bellator, DAZN, the ease of access, and all the other things we've talked about, it's hard to cut through the noise. It's hard to get your name out of the clutter. And to do that in a sustained period of time while you have losses, that's hard to do. And with only 2 fights to make anyone feel anything at all, with just the high frequency rate of fights, pretty much unheard of for this era. But nonetheless, I feel like he did it, and he's my pick for the most polarizing fighter of 2019. Next, TJ Dillashaw. Like I said, he's 16-4 overall, 8-2 out of his last 10. His last fight was against Henry Cejudo, UFC Fight Night 143, or UFC on ESPN +1. I feel like he's another polarizing name, but when I think of the fighter that this year fell off the most, the fighter that came out of 2018 into this year, 2019, with a head full of steam, all types of options on the table, on the cusp of becoming a star, and then it just all sank away. And for me, when I think of one person, it's like weird trying to do this because you have to think of someone that's been off the grid for a little bit. So there are some names out there you could say. Had Stipe Miocic lost to DC, he would have been my pick just because of the fact that, he sat out for a year and then only fought once. But hey, he wins. That plays out wonderfully. TJ Dillashaw only fights once this year. It's in the beginning of the year. Loses controversially after he had to do God knows what to cut all that weight to get down to 125. Trying to go after the champ era. Head full of clout after he essentially chased Demetrius Johnson off the one championship, or at least that's how the public perception was that he was this relentless killer, willing to fight everyone. And DJ, he was spoiled. He wasn't ready for a real challenge. In steps Henry Cejudo. TJ Dillashaw has all this clout in the world. Goes down there, the fight happens, it ends controversially, and then he steps into USADA woes. He has the Oprah moment where he has to go and talk to Chael. Says, he does it wrong, which to his credit, he does admit it. But in the grand scheme, I don't really know what that means. You lost a year off your career. Unless something happens down the pipeline, who knows what's going to happen with USADA, if the rules are going to change, because it seems like they make up their rules as they go. And we could talk about that at another time, too, just as far as what is going on with USADA. Their deal with the UFC is not indefinite. It's going to be up at some point. So what's going to happen in the future with that? That's another conversation that we could talk about. But nonetheless, it looks like TJ Dillashaw went from 2018, settling a rivalry with Cody Garbrandt, getting some of his reputation back. He got some of his reputation back. He basically got a bunch of clout off of Demetrius Johnson's name. It seemed like Henry Cejudo was easy pickings. Not to mention the fact that ESPN had this huge rollout for ESPN Plus, because let's all remember that 2 million number that they pushed to roll out and announce how successful the app was in the beginning. That was all because of the Brooklyn card. Bringing the fighters out, having them do first take in the car wash. TJ Dillashaw was a part of that. And to just think of where the guy was from 2018, all the different narratives, and to think where he is now, where all of that, it's like he got the exact opposite effect of what he was trying to get this year. It played out I'm sure when he was thinking like, oh, fighters have these mental moments where they sit down and think, what's the worst case scenario? I'm pretty sure that this is worse than the worst case scenario when he was back in Brooklyn getting ready to strap up and fight Henry Cejudo in Brooklyn. This has just played out poorly for him. I don't know what's going to happen with his reputation moving forward if he comes back. When he comes back, what does he look like? What's the landscape like? Fan reception, lost dollars, all of these things, sponsorships. Who's going to want to sponsor him? Not to mention he was getting Muscle Farm money. He moved out with Dwayne. All of these things, money was being spent. Like, he had a big story going on. TJ Dillashaw was in a very crossroads moment. And as we sit here now, heading into 2020, he's completely off the grid. So again, when I think of MMA in 2019, and I think of who was the fighter that it seemed like they had it all heading into the year, but now heading out, I don't know where they are at all, and I don't know when we'll hear from them again in any sort of relevant manner. I'm thinking TJ Dillashaw, and that's really unfortunate. Sorry, the third fighter I wanted to talk about, and for me, this is the one out of all three sort of categories that I had a little bit of trouble with, but I already put it out there, so it's no secret. Jorge Masvidal, and like I said, he sits at 35-13 overall, the current BMF title holder, and I'm not going to get into what does that mean in the hierarchy and things like that. I already broke that down. I do feel the need to say that that's going to be a narrative to see how these things play out over time, how that affects business. But when I think of just a fighter that had a big year, a breakout year, who's the one fighter we always talk about, metrics as far as who can break and who can pierce the mainstream conscious? Who's the one fighter that actually did that this year? Some could say Israel Adesanya. You wouldn't be wrong. But for me, I think of a guy that was stuck completely in the mud. It's like, what's more impressive? Going from complete unknown to known commodity, or sort of treading water as a 500 fighter, 35-13, and even 6-4 in his last 10, which is sort of a microcosm for his career as a whole. Which is more impressive, going from unknown to known, or being stuck in the middle for year and year and year, and then finally having this breakout moment? For me, I think I would have to lean towards that. For Jorge Masvidal, he was 3-0 in 2019 with wins over Darren Till, Ben Askren, and Nate Diaz. For a guy that reputation of being the decision fighter, it stuck with Jorge Masvidal for a little bit, but he was able to shake it this year. Put on 3 performances that you just can't deny. I mean, the Ben Askren one might be up for knockout of the year. The Nate Diaz fight was a back and forth, not so much back and forth, but it was an action-packed fight. It was an action-packed fight. He showed up in all 3 fights this year. For a guy that was stuck in the mud as far as, trading wins and losses back and forth, he was on fire this year. All of his interviews, he brought the fire. You could tell that the moment he was waiting for it because he was comfortable, because he had been sort of stuck around flirting with stardom for quite some time. And I feel like it just sort of came off. You look at his interviews with Dan Lembertard. You look at interviews he did with Jalen and Jacoby, First Take, going on all these ESPN platforms. And he's just breathing confidence, energy. You could just feel it. He's not someone like Henry Cejudo who you could tell he's excited for the moment. He feels like this is a pinnacle moment. Jorge Masvidal came across like he's a guy like, I've been seething and waiting. I've been waiting for years for you guys to call me. And now that you're here, I have so much detail to convey to the audience. The mainstream, they look at that stuff. To us, to MMA people in the circle, we just want to know, can you fight or not? That flying knee that he landed on Ben Askren, we want to see stuff like that. The fight with Nate Diaz, we would have watched that even if it was in Bellator. We don't care. But as far as the mainstream and breaking out and metrics and, we talk about business on a bad end, but if we're going to talk about on a higher end, what are things that can move the needle and pierce the conscience and move MMA a little bit? Because it's not going to be a flood. It's going to be little things, little markers here and there. who can move that conversation forward? A guy like Israel Adesanya, clean cut, good looking, decent interviews, fan friendly fight style. That's easy and a no brainer to see why he broke out. But now to see that we have a guy that isn't too high on the trash talking unless it's brought to his front door in Jorge Masvidal, it's just like, how can you not get behind it? So I feel like the fans, as far as the hardcores, the people that have been around, we know what time it is, and we can appreciate Jorge Masvidal getting this elevated, level of status, however you want to word it. We can appreciate it. But Jorge Masvidal also has that mainstream appeal because I just feel like he has that realness because he's been matured in the fight game. He's not a guy that just won 10 in a row and just got there so fast. All of that, you can feel all these things. They come out in his interviews. And I feel like the mainstream is eating it up. And if he can continue to match this energy, let's say, for instance, now that he has a title to his name, which I'm sure his checkbook will reflect, the more money you have, the cleaner you can make yourself look, the easier your PR campaigns can become. And if you match that with another 3-0 year, then who knows really where Jorge Masvidal could be. But that one is a little bit more, if you're a hardcore, you're probably listening to this saying like, okay, we already know all this. But as far as the casuals, those people, so to speak, that's something I think they're really interested in. And one thing or one fighter that I really think that moving forward, it's going to be interesting to see what actually comes of that. Will we look back on the BMF title as just a little anecdote on the sport? Or will we look at that as a unique vehicle for guys to platform ahead? Guys that are coming through alternate routes. Nate Diaz, had he won, I would be saying a lot of the same things that I'm saying about Jorge, about Nate. Jorge just so happened to win. But if the BMF title can serve as a vehicle for guys that really aren't with the flashiness and the this and that, the hoopla, if it can get those guys paid through this way, I'm for it. But nonetheless, when I think about MMA in 2019, and I think about the breakout star, the guy that broke through to mainstream consciousness, I think about Jorge Masvidal. All right, so before I get out of here, just wanted to talk about one of the fights of the decade. Just sort of talk about, like I said, everyone's getting their end of year, end of decade list together. So I wanted to talk about one of the fights that I feel like I have to bring up when I look back on this past decade from 2010 to 2020. Obviously, UFC 245 is going down tonight. There's other cards going down. The year's not over yet. The decade's not over yet, so I understand. But nonetheless, these things are fluid, so I just feel like I can start reflecting on some of the fights that have gone down that before we turn the page on this past decade, I just have to mention and sort of reflect on a bit. So for me, the first fight on this list that I just have to mention, UFC 139, Shogun Rua versus Dan Henderson, the first fight. This was at the SAP Center in San Jose, California. Dan Henderson won 48-47 on the judges' scorecards via decision. And just thinking back on that fight, it's like Dan Henderson, he was 28-8 when this fight went down. Shogun, he was 20-5. Both of these guys, even how the fight, if you were around back then in terms of being a fan of the sport, if you remember Kane and JDS, that fight got scrapped. And the Henderson-Shogun fight got announced. Dan Henderson, he got re-signed. He was coming on, I do believe it was a 3-fight win streak and Strikeforce prior to that. And then he had some excellent fights in Strikeforce, but I do remember that, okay, it was sort of like, all right, he's back. This is going to be a good fight, but I don't really know what to make of it because Shogun Rua, he had lost 2 fights after he lost his title to John Jones, and so it was just a weird meeting at the time where I didn't really know what to expect. And this is one of those fights when I think back on the decade that was, not every fight has to be, 2 undefeated, 20-0 versus 20-0, everything doesn't have to be that. Sometimes it can be those fights where you're just, I think on Mark Hunt versus Bigfoot Silva, and that took place in Australia, and it's like, think back on that fight. That is sort of an example of what I'm talking about, of like a fight that I didn't really know what to expect going in. I just sort of turned it on expecting to just watch the fight. But what unfolded was pure madness. And when I think about Dan Henderson versus Shogun Rua 1, that's exactly what happened. I remember just watching that card because I was already all in on it because Kane and JDS was supposed to be on it. But I do remember Dan Henderson was coming back, and Shogun, who everyone knows is my favorite light heavyweight, it was like, all right, it's an interesting meeting. Let's see what happens. And then you've got Dan Henderson dropping Shogun, and Shogun's on his back foot, and Shogun has to battle back. And by the end of the fight, Dan Henderson is basically just holding on, trying to make it to the bell, and blood all over the place, and different transitions. And at certain points, you could tell both guys were gassed. Transitions were happening in slow motion. It was just a perfect example of a fight happening where I didn't know what to expect going in, but by the time the fight was over, I was completely captivated, and days and weeks after, I was still buzzing about the fight. So when I think about fights of this decade, obviously there's going to be room for, your Conor versus Aldo and John Jones and all that, but I just think about fights that completely caught me off guard in the best sort of way. A fight where I just was watching it to sort of get through it, to sort of see the names compete, to see the stars that I know, the names I'm familiar with, to sort of see them back in action. But what I actually got was a real fight that made it feel like there were real implications on the line. And even though it was a 5-round fight, which, again, going back to then, we're used to that now, the main event being a 5-round thing. But I do believe Martin Kampmann and Carlos Condit, that was the first, and obviously you can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I do believe that was around then. So just the idea in general of having a 5-round main event was still relatively new. And this was one of the first ones I can remember of the new 5-round main event, non-title fight. This was one of the first ones that made me think, you know what, we should actually stick to this. And I know that there are conversations floating currently about, contracts, fighters aren't getting paid more to fight 5 rounds, especially if there isn't a belt on the line. And hey, like I said, if you guys hit me up and you guys are interested about it, I have different interviews. Nixon_speaks on Twitter if you guys have a specific topic or anything. But just getting back to this fight, it's like 5-round main events at that time, it was a new thing. It was still a little bit novelty, it felt like, because I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that this was a 5-rounder between two guys that weren't fighting for a title, and Dan Henderson had just gotten finished coming over from Strikeforce, so it was just weird. And then Dan Henderson drops Shogun. Shogun has to battle back. It's just one of those fights that just took your breath away when you were not expecting it to. And that was probably the best part. And that's probably one of the main reasons why, for me, when I think back on 2010 to 2020, I will always remember Dan Henderson versus Shogun Rua 1. Sorry, that's pretty much it for the formal stuff on this. Like I said, to basically recap, Kevin Lee, he's the most polarizing guy I've got for 2019. TJ Dillashaw, he fell off the grid the most. And Jorge Masvidal, he was the breakthrough fighter of the year. And when I think back, my first fight of the decade that I really want to remember and will remember when I think back on 2010 to 2020, Dan Henderson, Shogun Rua 1, UFC 139, and it took place at the SAP Center, with Dan Henderson winning via unanimous decision 48-47 on all judges' scorecards. Sorry, that's it for this one. Like I said, Nixon_speaks on Twitter. UFC 245 is going down tonight. That's going to be an interesting one just because a lot of storylines have to play out for that one, right? And it's just going to be interesting, and maybe this can segue into the next topic. But one of the stories for me, and I'm guessing just because of upload times and things like that, I'm going to assume by the time people are really getting around to hearing this, it's already going to be too late. So I'll skip any type of last minute predictions or things like that. But one storyline for me that by Monday or Tuesday, I want to see what these pay-per-view numbers are like. Because there's a lot of talk and a lot of hand-wringing about when it comes to these fighters and they have to promote themselves. We tell them constantly that they get out there and they do it and that they're going to get money on the back end. And honestly, for this one, I don't really hear it because we got duped. We got duped by the media on this one. We got told that this was going to get dirty and dark and everyone should get ready to have their hands over their ears, and nothing happened. But we promoted it and we put it out there, and we got Colby Covington doing things, and we don't really know how to react to him. And then we got Kamaru Usman, who we let basically sit on the shelf for the rest of the year, and we're not really pressuring him on that because we kind of want him to be the good guy, but we're still calling him Marty Usman, so we don't really know. But we want him to be loud too, because of these mystical pay-per-view buys that may not come there because of the different format that we're in now. And it's just frustrating because I don't want to see in the future Colby Covington having to go out there and question his morals for a paycheck when he's getting paid more than Amanda Nunes, who's the champ, and he's getting paid double her, and he's on top of the card. It just doesn't make sense, and it's a little frustrating that we tell these fighters to go out there and, promote, push, PR, things like that. But then on the back end, there is no guarantee for it. So it just makes me want to tell a guy like Kamaru Usman, you should really buck what the fans have to say, because at the end of the day, it's not going to be reflected in your paycheck. If you're going in as the champion and you're making roughly, $500,000, is that really going to, flex $100,000, which if you're talking about questioning your morals, I mean, I guess if that's the price tag you want on it, go ahead. But we are not talking about a difference of millions of dollars here. This idea that guys are going to talk themselves into these Conor McGregor-esque paydays, that storyline has got to stop. Because what's going to happen is you're going to leave a situation where more guys end up like Kevin Lee, where they face plant and they have to do different things like uproot their family and move around because they got the quick money, because they got a quick little insurgence into their paycheck because they talk quick to get the cheap money. But then when the real heat came and they caught a L, now all of a sudden they have to sort of figure out where did it all go wrong when the money was never that big of a difference, and you could have really just been who you were to begin with, because the pay-per-views were always going to be what they were going to be. So it's going to be interesting to see by Monday or Tuesday what this UFC 245 pay-per-view does, because there was a lot of talk and a lot of wringing of the hands about, okay, well, Colby Covington and Kamaru will put up with the talk, which wasn't even that bad, which was another thing. There was a lot of snowflaking about the talk. There wasn't really that much talk. It wasn't any darker than what Khabib and Conor McGregor did. It wasn't that irregular to what John Jones and DC did. Yet there was this narrative out there for whatever reason because Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington and this and that. But then we're supposed to be cool with it because, hey, these guys are going to get paid more, right? Not necessarily. If you're talking about $500,000 to $400,000 as opposed to $3 million to now you get a fight with a Conor McGregor or someone like that to where it's actually worth it. Now there's a flex room of maybe $1 to $2.5 million. It's just frustrating because we have a situation where going into this fight, I can't even really find legitimate breakdowns and reactions to this fight. Everyone just has a personal stake in it, and everyone's trying to find a way to segue and hem their conversation about how they feel about this fight, when the truth of the matter is that the pay-per-views for this fight, I truly feel like we're going to be what it was going to be. These guys didn't have to do all this, they're just trying to build the fight up and this and that. And Tyron Woodley, he was supposed to fight Colby Covington at some point. So now we're damaging careers and things like that, which just brings up a conversation on what to do with him. And so now there's contenders in the forms of bodies in the way of the division, all for a fight that we were told, don't worry, this will be fine. We have to stomach a dark moment that never came because these guys are going to get a big payday that never really got here for pay-per-view buys that ESPN is never going to cash out on, all for the price of morals that never had to be questioned and never had to be compromised. So that's my little mini rant on that, but nonetheless, that is going down tonight as well. So that's going to be interesting to see who comes out the other side of that and what happens moving forward with the winner of that. That's for the UFC welterweight title. So, all right, that's it for this one. Kevin Lee, most polarizing. TJ Dillashaw fell off the most. Jorge Masvidal broke through the most. Shogun Hendo, fight of the decade, first one for me when I remember thinking back on 2010 to 2020. So, all right, that's it for this one. You can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. And I'll see you guys later on in the week.